Look at a royal portrait. You'll see crowns, jewels, and faces painted to look flawless, symbols of power that seemed untouchable. But what if I told you those same faces were hiding a deadly secret? The dynasty that ruled half the world wasn't chosen by God. They were destroyed by their own blood. One king was born so broken that his own mother recoiled in horror at the sight of him. He couldn't walk until he was 4, he couldn't chew food, and his body collapsed long before his empire did. Yet his story wasn't just personal tragedy, it was the downfall of the most powerful family in Europe, and the truth behind it is more terrifying than any curse or conspiracy. For centuries, the image of royalty was carefully crafted to look divine. Painters smoothed away flaws, stretched jaws into noble lines, and filled canvases with symbols of strength. To the public, kings and queens weren't just rulers, they were living proof that God himself favoured their bloodline. But behind the gilded frames and polished crowns, the truth was far darker. The most powerful dynasty in Europe wasn't blessed, it was cursed by its own obsession with purity. What looked like perfection on canvas was, in reality, a family pushing their bloodline past the breaking point. And at the very centre of this illusion stood the Habsburgs, a royal house that believed they could cheat nature by keeping power locked inside their own family. They thought they were protecting their empire. Instead, they were quietly destroying it. November 6, 1661. Inside the royal palace of Madrid, the most important child in Spain is born, the heir to an empire that stretches across Europe and the Americas. But something is wrong. The newborn's head is swollen, his breathing shallow, and his body frail. Court records say his own mother, Queen Mariana, shuddered at the sight of him. She refused to nurse her child, not out of cruelty, but out of instinctive horror. And there was a reason. She wasn't just his mother. She was also his cousin and his aunt. If that sounds impossible, it's because the Habsburg family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a circle. Charles's father, King Philip IV, had married his own niece. Generations of these tangled unions had left the royal bloodline so contaminated that Charles entered the world already broken. The infant who should have symbolized the strength of Spain instead carried centuries of genetic collapse. His life would become the most shocking example of what happens when human beings push bloodlines past nature's limits. To understand how a child like Charles could even exist, you have to look at the family's obsession with one dangerous idea: keeping power in their blood. The Habsburg dynasty had a motto: let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. And they meant it literally. For nearly 2 centuries, generation after generation of Habsburgs married within their own family. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles wedding nieces, even double first cousins binding themselves together in the name of purity. On paper it sounded like a brilliant strategy. Why risk the battlefield when marriages could unite empires? But every union tightened the circle of their DNA. Scientists today estimate that more than 80% of Spanish Habsburg marriages were between close relatives, not distant cousins you'd barely recognize at a reunion, but family members who shared grandparents, or even parents. By the time Charles was born, his family tree wasn't branching out, it was collapsing inward. All 8 of his great-grandparents descended from the same original couple, what the Habsburgs called royal purity. Modern science now calls genetic suicide. And Charles II would become the living proof of just how deadly that strategy could be. From the very beginning, it was clear t-shirt. Charles was no ordinary prince. At 4 years old, when most children were running, playing and speaking in full sentences, Charles could do neither. He still couldn't walk, his thin legs bowed and weak, unable to support even his small frame. Servants carried him everywhere in special chairs. The future king of Spain treated more like an infant than a boy. His speech was just as delayed. For years he said nothing at all, and when words finally came, they were nearly impossible to understand. His tongue was too large for his mouth, and his jaw jutted so far forward that saliva streamed constantly down his chin. Court attendants carried fine silk cloths just to wipe the drool from his face. Ambassadors from foreign courts, expecting to meet a royal heir, instead found a child whose appearance was so startling they struggled to hide their shock. And then there was the infamous Habsburg jaw, a deformity so severe that Charles could never fully close his mouth. Eating was a daily ordeal. He couldn't chew. Instead, food had to be cut into tiny pieces, soaked in wine, or pureed so he could swallow it whole. One ambassador wrote that watching the young prince dine was more like watching a pelican gulp its food than a king enjoying a meal. But these were just the visible struggles. Inside, his body was breaking down in ways the royal physicians couldn't explain. Every illness that swept through the palace, measles, chickenpox, smallpox, hit Charles harder than anyone else. Each disease left new scars, new weaknesses, and new fears that Spain's heir might not survive childhood at all. As Charles grew older, the problems didn't fade. They only multiplied. His tutors reported that he couldn't focus, couldn't retain lessons, and often stared blankly as if lost in another world. Mathematics, languages, even basic writing, skills every royal heir was expected to master, were nearly impossible for him. It wasn't laziness, his mind simply couldn't keep up. Physically, his body betrayed him at every turn. Puberty, the stage that should have transformed him into a man, never truly arrived. His voice stayed high, his body hair never came, and his growth was stunted. Court whispers grew louder. How could a boy who barely resembled a man possibly rule an empire? And worse, how could he ever produce an heir? Eating remained a humiliation. Charles swallowed food whole, unable to chew. His stomach became legendary in the worst way. Diplomats joked that he devoured entire meals like an animal, gulping down soaked bread, soft vegetables, and chopped meats without ever biting. One ambassador wrote with barely disguised disgust, "His Majesty swallows all he eats whole, for his teeth never meet." Illness clung to him like a shadow. If there was a sickness in Spain, Charles caught it. Smallpox nearly killed him. Rubella left him weak. Each recovery only added to his frailty, until the boy who should have been a symbol of power became a walking reminder of his dynasty's decay. And yet, despite it all, Charles was king. The crown sat on his head, the sceptre in his hand, but behind the pomp and ceremony was a young man failing in the one role history demanded of him, to secure the future of Spain. By the time Charles reached adulthood, Spain faced a crisis. The empire stretched across continents, but its survival depended on one thing: an heir. The solution seemed simple: marry the king to a young, healthy bride and secure the dynasty. But nothing about Charles was simple. At 18, he married Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess known for her beauty and charm. The wedding was magnificent, but the contrast between bride and groom was brutal. She walked gracefully down the aisle. He shuffled, weak and trembling, supported by attendants. Observers noted the strain on her face when it came time for the kiss. The wedding night revealed the truth that Spain's courtiers dreaded. Charles was incapable of consummating the marriage, not unwilling, incapable. His body simply couldn't perform. The pressure on Marie-Louise was merciless. For 10 years, she endured invasive fertility treatments, drinking revolting concoctions of herbs, animal parts, even powdered pearls. Nothing worked because the problem wasn't her. Palace whispers admitted what official records wouldn't. The king was broken. Out of desperation, Charles's mother even turned to mystics. Some nights the young king was forced to sleep beside the corpses of long-dead saints and kings in the belief their holy power might cure him. Imagine it, the ruler of Spain, drooling and sickly, lying next to rotting corpses in a hopeless attempt to become a man. Then, tragedy. At just 26, Marie-Louise died suddenly. Officially, it was appendicitis. Unofficially, rumours spread like wildfire: poison, despair, even suicide. Whatever the truth, Charles was devastated. Despite everything, she had been one of the few people who treated him with kindness. But the Spanish crown couldn't pause for grief. Within months, Charles was pushed into a second marriage, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a woman from a famously fertile family of 17 children. If anyone could give Spain an heir, surely it would be her. But history repeated itself. Maria Anna never became pregnant, not once. The truth was undeniable. The Habsburg line was finished. The King of Spain could not continue his bloodline, no matter how many prayers, potions, or desperate rituals were tried. By his late 20s, Charles looked decades older. His body, already fragile, began to collapse entirely. His skin turned pale and blotched, his limbs swollen, his belly distended. He suffered seizures, fevers, and mysterious pains no physician could explain. One report described him as so ugly he scared little children, and so sickly he looked half dead. The empire that once projected power now had a king who could barely stand without help. Parate, the royal court abandoned medicine for superstition. Priests whispered that Charles was bewitched, cursed by dark forces. Exorcisms were performed on the King of Spain, not once, but repeatedly. Witnesses claimed he foamed at the mouth, shrieked in agony, and even convulsed as holy words were read over him. The image of Europe's most powerful monarch writhing on the floor like a possessed man only deepened the sense that Spain's glory had become a nightmare. By 30, Charles was a shell of a man. He could barely eat, he could barely walk, and he had no heir. Every breath he took pushed Spain closer to chaos. On November the 1st, 1700, at just 38 years old, Charles II finally succumbed. After his death, an autopsy was performed, and the findings stunned even hardened physicians. His body was described as a cadaver that did not contain a single drop of blood. His intestines were rotted, his lungs corroded, his heart the size of a peppercorn, and his testicles, the organs that should have continued his dynasty, were said to be completely shriveled. It was the final confirmation of what everyone had suspected. Charles II had not been a man destroyed by war, poison, or conspiracy. He was destroyed by his own bloodline. For centuries, people whispered about curses, witchcraft, and divine punishment. But modern science has revealed the truth behind Charles II's horrifying condition, and it's even darker than superstition. Geneticists who studied his family tree discovered that Charles was more inbred than the child of siblings. His inbreeding coefficient, what scientists use to measure how genetically similar your parents are, was over 25%, the equivalent of being born to a brother and sister. That number wasn't an accident. It was the direct result of 2 centuries of the Habsburg marriage strategy. Instead of branching outward, the royal family tree had folded in on itself again and again. Out of 16 great-great-grandparents, Charles had only 9. The rest were duplicates, the same ancestors repeating generation after generation until his DNA collapsed. This genetic trap explains everything. His weak immune system, his infertility, his grotesque jaw, his seizures, his stunted body. Charles wasn't cursed. He was the final product of a dynasty that treated power like a bloodline to be hoarded rather than shared. His very body was a living autopsy of the Habsburg obsession with purity. And in the end, it wasn't foreign enemies or assassins that destroyed Spain's most powerful dynasty. It was their own DNA. When Charles II breathed his last in 1700, it wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of a dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries. With no heir to inherit his crown, the Spanish throne became a prize fought over by Europe's most powerful houses. What followed was the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that redrew the map of Europe and proved just how much one frail king's body could change the fate of nations. For the Habsburgs, Charles's death was more than a political loss. It was a mirror held up to their greatest obsession. Their relentless drive to keep power locked inside their family had achieved the exact opposite of what they wanted. Instead of guaranteeing their empire's survival, it had doomed their line to extinction. Today, historians call Charles El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But the real spell wasn't cast by witches or priests. It was cast by centuries of royal arrogance, of marriages that defied nature, of a dynasty that believed blood mattered more than survival. In the end, the most powerful empire in the world was brought down not by enemies, not by assassins, not even by war, but by the weakness hidden in the veins of its own king. A weakness no crown, no army, and no illusion of royal perfection could ever do. Guys, his story of Charles II isn't just history, it's a warning. An empire that seemed untouchable collapsed from the inside, undone not by swords or cannons, but by choices made at the dinner table and at the altar. The Habsburgs believed they were protecting their legacy, but in the end, their obsession destroyed it. And maybe that's the most shocking part. The downfall of one of history's greatest dynasties wasn't fate or magic or a curse. It was human arrogance, written into the blood of a king who never had a chance. But here's the question. Was Charles II the most tragic ruler in history, or just the most famous example of a secret that other royal families still hide? Some say his story is only the beginning. What do you think? If you want to uncover more hidden stories history tried to bury, make sure to subscribe, because the past is full of secrets waiting to be revealed.